Hi, everyone. My name is Justine Dansereau. I'm the Provincial Support Agent for School Climate, Bullying, and Violence for the MEQ. I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Korah. Today, we're going to be discussing the different considerations around Tier 3 intervention. Considering my dossier, this is something that has come up numerous times when we have bullying, violent situations, extreme behaviors. So Catherine and I had multiple discussions and we wanted to partner up on this topic. So without further ado, Korah.
Thank you, Justine. And so this is a topic that the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management has been presenting for quite a few years now. We started with the pyramid of intervention, and then earlier this year, I started off presenting the flow chart of intervention and to be able to make sense of the different tiers. And so looking at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and then moving forward. And as I presented more recently with a colleague of mine, Heather Scott from Aldi, we received a question about understanding how to know when a student is at a certain tier, and how do we know, how to move forward from one tier to the next. And so Justine and I thought that it'd be a good idea to collaborate. And today we're going to focus mainly on tier 3 interventions, but we will be answering some of those questions. And so just for those who may not be familiar with the RTI model and the different tiers, tier 3 is the individualized approach. And so tier 1 is for all, tier 2 is for some, and tier 3 is for few. And at this level, we're looking at highly challenging students that are unable to function well in the classroom and or in the school. And keep in mind that although we may be focusing on tier 3 interventions, tier 1 and tier 2 interventions are still beneficial for those students regardless. So now we're going to look at the considerations for tier 3 interventions. Justine?
Yeah, so basically there could be a lot of gray zones. Catherine and I had numerous discussions about this topic, and we came up with a couple of points or different elements that we thought would be pertinent for all of the school boards across Quebec. So basically we're looking at the different gray zones that would need to be discussed as a team. So there's different situations that are not one size fits all, is kind of what we're trying to explain in this point. This can also lead to a debriefing to further look at triggers, support offered, and the next steps. So it's really important, whether you use CPI, whether you use BMS as a mechanism for behavior management systems, debriefing is a very important element when there's a situation that happens with a student, with staff members, with other students as well, so that we could really look at the triggers, ABC charts, what are the patterns of behavior, etc., to really look at what the next steps could be for this particular student. It's important that it's a situation-based element. So it's really important to look at the situation and not just as a whole, these are general behaviors, but to really take a deeper dive into the data or into the frequency or where these events are actually happening to then proceed with the next steps.
Wonderful. And so, of course, when we're thinking of tier 3 level students, it's never a clear-cut situation. It's never just true, straightforward types of behavior. It could be that the student has different types of family situations, may have gone through some childhood trauma, may have some hypersensitivity and is reactive and so forth. And so we really need to look at each student individually and to make sense of what's going on there behind the behavior.
So academics, oftentimes we get the question, whether you're a PED consultant, teacher, resource teacher, admin, no matter what your role is, support staff, academics can remain unaffected. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because a child has a specific behavior or is displaying a behavior that academics are going to be impacted directly. But usually in the long term, behavior can impede the learning. So it's really important to keep that in mind. When you have team meetings or meetings with the parents, maybe currently the behavior is not impeding the learning, but in the long run, if these behaviors keep going, it's really important to have that behind, the scenes or in back of your mind to say, keep an eye out for the actual academics, because if this behavior is continuing, it definitely will or could impede the academic side of things as well.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of interventions, we have come to realize, both in our roles, Justine and I, working with students, that by the time students get to third tier, they do have a harder time working into small group pull-out types of models. At this point, they probably benefit more from individualized, personalized types of supports one-on-one at that point.
This is a really important last point for this slide. So basically, success is not quantified by improved behavior or functionality, but rather observing stability as an indicator with a void of regressions. So what we're explaining in this particular point is that sometimes consistency is a demonstration of success. If we are able to create a consistent and stable level of behaviors or expectations within the classroom or within the school, even if it's not in the class, that's okay. That's an indicator that things are actually progressing and they're improving or they're stabilized, and that the behavior is basically not regressing further.
I actually had this conversation with somebody yesterday where they were quite discouraged because they felt that some of the interventions that they were putting in place, they weren't getting immediate results, and feeling like there was no success there, and that what they were doing wasn't working. And sometimes just about reframing that and understanding that if we're starting in the negative and that really we're stabilizing that student, this is just as important as it is to be able to help that student move forward and to be able to develop and so forth. And so let's not forget that piece. It is quite important. And I could understand for adults, you're working so hard at things and you want to see some impact, or you want to see some results, but it's not always that simple, especially if we're talking about tier 3 students that have had years and years of different adverse situations or struggles. It's things don't change overnight.
I would even add, Catherine, that it's important to look at our own expectations as adults and manage those expectations with regards to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the second slide, basically other considerations are it's a continuum and cycle from tier to tier. Each tier can have its own tier system. So this is something that I've been saying, if you've heard me mention this in the past. I know that Catherine and I had multiple discussions on this. I actually say in my other position at Sophia Laurier School Board as a PED consultant for school climate specifically, I will usually work with the third tier of the third tier. So if ever you've heard me say this, that's usually when I get called in for situations. They're really, if we look at each tier, so tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, each tier can be separated in 3 tiers. So really you can have a continuum within that tier. And I think that's really important to understand. You might be in the first tier, slowly climbing up to the second tier, but you're not quite at the second tier yet. Where are we within that tier? And that's a really good observation that we can have in the back of our minds to say, oh, are we creeping up to the second tier or the second tier to the third tier? And how do we go back down? So I just wanted everyone to have that within their ideas of what tiers could look like.
Absolutely. And so the goal isn't necessarily to keep the student in the class at all costs, especially when we're thinking about tier 3 students. We oftentimes come to the realization that those students at that level really have a hard time functioning in the classroom. And success doesn't mean that they need to stay in the class at all costs. It could be that we set up different types of adapted environments for them in the school. They could even have an adapted schedule where they're at school part-time. I mean, there's so many different variations of that we could set up for the student, and that we as adults can feel that what we're doing is successful. And so really looking at it little piece by piece, and also looking at it day by day. I mean, we have students for whom they may be going through a harder time, and really at this point, there's not much that we could be doing in school. They're not receptive to learning at this point. And so it's really trying to establish safety and for them to be able to have that routine of coming to school. But then if we're able to get them stabilized and then we can work on other things, then this is where, the neat piece about thinking of thinking outside the box, looking at not just being in class, but looking at what else could we be putting in place in the school. And that's kind of where for the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management, we've been supporting a lot of schools to put in place a nurturing support center. And that could be a great example of another place in the school where the student could go, and not just to go take a break, they could go to actually learn and do some academics in that space outside of the class setting.
Well said, Catherine. So again, all of this could be relayed back depending on the situation. So this is very situation dependent. I wanted to preface that with that information. So Bill 56 could be considered. So Bill 56 is an act to prevent and deal with bullying and violence in schools. Definitely needs to be considered in order to provide a healthy and secure learning environment for all students to develop to their full potential. My apologies, this is not a gender neutral language in the bill yet, so I did modify it by saying their full potential, free from any bullying or violence. So I just wanted everyone to understand, if you're not already aware, Bill 56 encompasses 9 different elements. Those elements are usually found in your ABAV, anti-bullying and anti-violence plans per school. This is by law mandated that each school must have these plans. And so I really encourage you to ask your administrator or to inform yourself if you're working in a school to see what that plan actually entails with regards to the different measures that could be taken for different situations. So again, third tier can often have violence or bullying situations, and when we're looking at violent or bullying situations, we do automatically go back to the ABAV plan, and the ABAV plan is based off of Bill 56. So I just wanted to get that in there so that everyone is aware.
Of course, because, when we're talking about, these types of behaviors, we cannot dismiss the bill. I mean, this is the next place where we need to address it, and that you need to follow the protocol at that point.
Correct.
Yes. And so the next point is focusing on prevention. And I think part of the reason why we put together the Center of Excellence, put together the pyramid of intervention, all of these suggestions, they were not made to be utilized in crisis intervention. They were made to be utilized in a preventative matter. And that the more that we can put things in place for all, so best universal practices, and then look at more targeted perhaps for certain students. And then we're looking at for tier 3, more individualized. But the more that we have all of these things in place, the more that the likelihood of there being success for that student, and it does have an impact on all of the stakeholders, whether it's the adults that are working with the student, the other students that are there in the class that are witnessing or living that experience with the student, and of course the student themselves. And so prevention. I say this all the time. And I can't help but think, I've seen this before where, and actually I saw a document more recently with complex cases and risk of service, where there was a bris de service. And I saw in the statistics that there's about, at the elementary level, a good 20 to 24% of these students that don't even have an IEP put in place, and yet they're at that extreme level of complex cases and that have lost, getting support measures put in place. And, I kind of asked myself the question, like, why is that? Where did we miss our chance to be able to support that student earlier? And so, yeah, prevention. I can't even say it enough.
Can I add a point, Catherine?
Yeah.
Before we next point, I mean, we could leave it up there, but I just wanted to state that in element 2 in the ABAV plan, it's for preventative measures, specifically for bullying and violence. So this could be a universal way of thinking, or a universal implementation, or it can also be specific to different tiers. But this is really the way that committees, ABAV committees, could really get together and to discuss what's currently happening, what the trends are, what the portrait of the school is, and maybe discuss different preventative measures and indicate them in the second element of their ABAV plan as well. So I just wanted to put that in there. Yes. For the last point, students in the third tier can require additional services and support. Examples are, but not limited to, the following. So school board professionals, consultants, school board consultants, external partners could be DYP, the CIS, medical, psychological, as well as community police officers. So there's a large variety of professionals that could be involved as well. So we just wanted to list a couple.
And if I may add, at this point, the teacher should not be the sole adult that is responsible for intervening and supporting a tier 3 student. At this point, we need to be able to rely on the force of the team. And so at the school level, so we're talking, at this point, not just resource, but support staff, looking at potentially resource teacher, looking at board support administrators, of course, looking at board support as well, involving the parents also at this level, I would say, and as you mentioned, all of the exterior partners as well. And so it is not meant for the teacher to bear the sole responsibility of these students. It's hard enough to be managing a whole classroom, and of course we're thinking of that one student, but how many other students in that class could be also tier 2, tier 3, and it just becomes a lot to manage. And so the power comes with the support of the team. This is another piece that I say often, besides prevention. It's rely on your team, work as a team, have a relay where, you could have some respite where you're able to also, we talked about brainstorming a little bit in our conversation earlier, Justine and I, to be able to make sense of that student. And so you need your colleagues to be able to do that. You can't do this on your own. Justine?
Yes, so we developed a couple of questions, reflection questions that could be discussed as a team. We thought it was really important to have this discussion internally, whether it's a couple of your colleagues or at a staff meeting. So we've jotted down a couple of questions, and I just, if you can just keep clicking, Catherine, so we can see the first one. Thank you so much. So the first question would be, how much time do you recommend before determining whether the student is responding to the intervention? So these are different questions that come up, whether in my workshops or in Catherine's workshops or work groups. It's something that we answer, and it's very gray, honestly. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I wanted to discuss that usually we look at 4 to 6 weeks in looking if the measures that we put in place are going to work. But I also wanted to discuss that it's not always 4 to 6 weeks that's a possibility. Sometimes after 2 to 3 days, we know right away that the student is not reacting well to this particular implementation, that we need to go back to the drawing board and change it right away. So again, it's situation dependent, and it depends on the severity of the behavior as well as the intensity. But Catherine, I'll let you complete that as well if you have further thoughts.
For sure. And to your point, Justine, when we're talking about explosive behaviors and behaviors that are escalating quite rapidly, perhaps because there's a situation at home that's happening for that student, or because they are reacting to something that's happening at school, obviously those are part of the gray zones that we mentioned earlier, that we cannot just say, okay, 4 to 6 weeks, regardless. It is about, using our judgment and to say, oh my goodness, no, this is not working and it's getting worse fast. And so we need to intervene. And if we're talking about, for example, behavior, bullying behavior or violence, at this point, then we know that we've jumped a step, and that this, and so that's addressed at a whole other level. But if we're focusing on something that's more progressive or more soft, even though we're perhaps from a tier 2, questioning whether what we're doing is working before we get to the tier 3, or that we're within a tier 3 and that, things are advancing, there's a few key elements that I want you to consider. I think the first piece is, if we look at the document that the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management created on the pyramid of intervention, we've got about a dozen lists of suggested things to try out. And so I would say to try a couple. So let's say 2 or 3. And then once you've tried, 2, I wouldn't say 3, perhaps more 2 at first. So trying with 2 different things. And then, yes, about trying them for a certain amount of time. But I think also it's about trying out in terms of intensity of intervention, in terms of frequency, in terms of timing. Sometimes it's not so much the intervention itself that's the problem, but it's the way that we're utilizing it, or the timing at which we're utilizing it, the time of day. Maybe we're not doing it often enough. Maybe we're doing it in the classroom and it needs to be outside the classroom. I mean, there's so many different elements to think about. And so intensity is one piece, frequency is one piece, in terms of timing as well. And then I would say, if after you've done all of that and you're noticing that there's no progression, then at that point, I would suggest for you to go back to that document and to look at other types of strategies. I mean, there's so many in there that you could try perhaps a couple more. And then if at that point, after having tried in rotation a few of these interventions, I would say that probably that would give you a good indicator that it is not working at this point, that the student is not responding. I don't know if there's anything else, Justine, you wanted to add for this point?
No, I really enjoyed the fact that you said if it's really an explosive behavior or something that's out of proportion, that, obviously maybe the police will even be contacted at that point, and It's not necessarily necessarily just up to the school team to manage and to keep trying. So again, it depends on the intensity of the situation and the severity of the situation as well. So that's perfect. I think we covered it. And it's very gray. It's very gray.
Oh, it is. And actually, as you were saying this, an idea popped in my mind. I think the other piece too, because I mentioned trying things in class, but then also trying out of class, sometimes it's the adult themselves. Sometimes, the teacher, because you've been doing this day in and day out, and it gets very frustrating and you feel bogged down, sometimes it's the energy of the adult that can nullify some of the interventions that we do. And so I mentioned before the power of the team. And so let's work as a relay. Sometimes it's not the intervention itself, but it's the way that it's conveyed. And sometimes it might be a good idea to have another adult try it out with a student, whether it's not necessarily a teacher, it could even be the school secretary. Oh my goodness, I've seen so many wonderful interventions done where the school secretary, because the student doesn't feel that the adult has to be nice, because they're not working, in the class with them, so they feel that more genuineness from the adult, it changes everything. And so I would say, again, go to your team to try out different things.
I would also even add caretakers. I've seen multiple caretakers take on students to help them with specific tasks and to reinforce or just to have a conversation. So, I mean, we're much larger of a team than we actually realize we are in a school sometimes when we're looking at the support staff as well. The second reflection question is, how does one know the student has changed tiers? So again, it's very gray. I also wanted to state that there are multiple tiers within a specific tier. Right. So I would actually say that mapping out the tier would be a good idea. First, to have a discussion or a dialogue with the team or with your school administrator to say, where is the student, or the resource team, if that's how your school board or your school functions. It's really important to look at the student is not just functioning in class, maybe the student is functioning outside of the classroom. So that would indicate that maybe we're at a third tier. If you're functioning well in the classroom, chances are you're not in a third tier, that we're still able to implement strategies within the classroom. So we're not quite there at the third tier. So again, I would strongly encourage everyone to look at the flow chart that is on the Center of Excellence Behavior Management site. We're going to give you the link a little bit later on, but Catherine, if you want to complete this question.
Sure. I mean, another piece that we brought up earlier in some of the considerations was the idea of that they may not benefit from working into small groups, and that at this point they probably succeed better individually, one-to-one. And so I say that would be another indicator. And so to what you were saying, Justine, that they're struggling in the class and that they seem to be more successful outside of the class is an indicator. But I would say also, the one-to-one is a second indicator as well. For us to know that they've gotten to tier 3. Now, from tier 1 to tier 2, we would be looking at different indicators, but today we're really focusing on the tier 3 students. And so that would definitely be giving you some indicator. Of course, depending on the student, some of them are very subtle, the up in progression from tier 2 to tier 3, and others, it's like you don't even need to ask yourself the question. It's like, bam, the behavior is so explosive that you're there, that you've reached at that point. And so this is where, it really changes, I guess, from case to case.
The third question is, when does one request additional support from school board professionals or consultants? So again, we are talking about situation-specific, events or, an outburst that can happen. If it's a violent outburst, extremely violent, we might not go from school board professionals. We might just jump to either the police or a school board consultant immediately. I just wanted to let everyone know that. So again, it's situation dependent, but in general, if we're gradually going up that pyramid and we're slowly going from tier 2 to tier 3, we have ad hoc meetings, IDT meetings, resource meetings, depending on how your board is working within your school system, meetings that school teams could have. You could have a teacher, spec ed tech, admin, start off the meeting just to recognize the needs of a specific student. Then we have school level special needs meetings where professionals are involved as well. And then we can graduate. And if the professionals, Catherine brought up a point earlier, I don't know if you want to share it or if I'm stealing your thunder, but she brought up the point that professionals could be in the loop. They don't necessarily have to be contacted depending on the situation as well. So we can keep this school psychologist, for example, in the loop. FYI, this is where, just to keep your heads up on something, and then possibly go through the process of requesting services from professionals such as speech, OT, psychologists, and so on, and then even consultants depending on the situation. But again, if there's an explosive situation or an urgent situation or something that is an emergency within a school system or in a school building, then you might just skip directly, and then everyone's going to be contacted immediately depending on the situation, even the school board. So I don't know, Catherine, if you have anything else to add to that.
Just one piece. To me, the central key player in this is the administrator. And so, when things are starting to bubble up in the class, and that the adult is starting to struggle with the student, and realizing that things are escalating and becoming more challenging, the first person that needs to be informed is the principal. And this is actually once the principal's informed, this is where you start the ball rolling to some of these in-school meetings, to then perhaps getting the professional and or consultant involved, and so forth. And so I wouldn't be doing this without the principal. They need to be the center of this, and they're part of the discussion. They're also the one that makes the decisions for some of these things. And so, to go back to my point about team collaboration, it shouldn't be up to the teacher to do this on their own and to request for support directly. It would be going through the school administrator.
No, very good point. And usually it's a school admin, honestly, that will actually request information or request services should they need additional services from either comp services, PED services, ed services, however your board is categorized. So 100%, that's a very well.
Yeah. And then the other point too that I was discussing with Heather Scott the other day, when we were preparing for another presentation that we'll be doing on the similar topic, is thinking of, before you get to the IEP, there may be some other steps, and this is very board specific or school even specific, but I know some schools working with the professional will look at putting in place an action plan first for that student, and then trying out different things in the action plan. And then when that's not sufficient, then you may move to perhaps referring to the professional and to be adding into an IEP at this point. But it does happen in increments. Alrighty, Justine.
Yeah, so basically, Catherine and I thought that potentially having a school-wide activity could be interesting for your school or your school staff. So we thought the idea of, as a school team, to look at each classroom list of students, and then to divide these students into different groups. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, just to make sense of which students require what level of support, but to also look at what the portrait is. Do you have 5 students that are in a tier 3, maybe 15 students that are in tier 2, and then only 5 in tier 1, right? So that you know how to disseminate your services. Or maybe it would be 20 students in tier 1, 2 students in tier 2, and maybe 1 student in tier 3, depending on how your class composition is made. Some classes are low ratio, so we understand that you might have a little bit more of tier 2 and tier 3, or mostly tier 3. So depending on how your class list is composed, that's an interesting activity to do, not just with teachers, but with support staff as well. So to really gain a better understanding of what your colleagues' level of support could be as well. And then for those students whom it's unclear, to discuss and brainstorm as a team. Is this student really a tier 2? Maybe for me, he's a tier 3, or she's a tier 3, or they're a tier 3. So it's really important to look at that example as well. Where does the student fall under with regards to academics, and where does the student fall under? Obviously, we're talking behavior here today, but it's interesting to see the academic portion as well, and then to look at the behavior components, where they fall.
And Justine, the other piece too is, it may be a good idea, let's say you're talking to a grade 5 teacher or a grade 4 teacher, to speak to the teacher from the previous year, and to get a sense from them what they experienced with the group the previous year. If it's a small school, of course, if it's a bigger school and the groups kind of shuffle around, you may want to speak to a few of your colleagues to get a sense of some of the students. And let's remember also that a tier is not fixed for a student. A student it's fluid. And so a student can go back and forth depending on what's going on in their lives, from a tier 1 to a tier 3. And it's true that some students are more at risk for staying higher into tier 2 and 3. but it is still possible for there to be some fluidity. I mean, we've witnessed this many, many times as they perhaps grow older, or perhaps they, fell on a teacher that the match was like a match made in heaven, and that they loved that teacher so much, or they clicked with them so much that they felt safe with that person, and that it really helped them to flourish. And then the year after, we thought things were fine, and that the student, grew up and did better. And then all of a sudden, some of the behaviors came back the year after. And so it is really, fluid from within the year, but also from year to year. And for not us to have these preconceived notions or these prejudgments, when we're hearing from a teacher from the previous year, oh my goodness, wait that you get this student. Oh my goodness, was it so hard to have them? You don't know, maybe they've grown up over the summer, maybe things have changed, and not to take things for granted. I mean, who knows how things can vary.
I would even add, Catherine, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks back with a colleague of mine and at Sophie Laurie's school board, and basically there was a student that we're going in and we're going to provide homebound tutoring for, and very intelligent, amazing student, but the behaviors were just really at that third tier of the third tier, I would say. I was going into the OIM system and Mosaic Portail, and I was going into ISM to look at further information in the past 2 weeks to get ready for this meeting. And I realized that there were a lot of positives for this student. And so we were at the third tier of the third tier, vraiment en bris de fonctionnement for this student. The student was not functioning in the classroom, or difficulty functioning even individually within the setting as well. So we were looking at what we were going to do and have a meeting to brainstorm with the admin and the school team as well as the parents. And so the parents came back and said, well, we started medication for our child, and the child was quite young, and so it was it's very rare that they'll prescribe at such a young age without giving any details about the student. But it was interesting to see that child literally went from the third tier of the third tier, right? All the way down to very low in tier 2, very low, and able to function in the classroom. Yes, a little bit of individualized support is needed still, but it was just significantly different. And so that's where you're talking about judgment. I'm not here to advocate for medication. That's not at all my goal here, but this is an example of, wow, this is completely different behavior. And that this molecule or this particular medication that this student was taking completely changed the dynamic for that child's learning experience, as well as for the other students in the classroom as well. So that's one example, but we can also have another example that has nothing to do with medication. That would be a trauma. So if a student is living trauma within their home, and then, for example, they're taken out of their home, placed with a family member, or placed, in a group home or in another area that they feel comfortable in, you can actually see that progression of change as well. And I've been involved in multiple situations where a student said, just sleeping in a really nice bed with sheets is so nice, and it really, like, honestly, I say to this story to this day, and my heart kind of breaks for that student. But it's so nice to see that child is now able to have self-actualization and evolve in a different capacity. And so that student was no longer in tier 3 within a week and a half to 2 weeks. Went down to, and then all of a sudden went down to tier 1 after a couple of months. So I just wanted to, share a couple of stories that I've actually experienced with students and their families that, will make this fluid change a little bit more concrete for everyone.
I love that you've shared some stories, Justine. It really kind of brings it to life and help people understand how things can progress quite quickly depending on the situation. And I feel like what you're speaking to that's really important to convey is insight, being able to make sense of what's going on with that student. So it's not just that we're focused on the behavior and the fact that it's bothering, it's what's going on for that student, what's behind the behavior, what else is happening in that student's life that has brought it to that place. And I think it's important for us to ask ourselves the questions too about what works for that student. And so when I was talking earlier about speaking to the teacher from the previous year, it's not just about situating the student where they were. It's also about knowing what worked for that student. What are the things that she put in place that you see were beneficial? And I would say, what are those things that could trigger? And so I think it's important that communication happens, between a school team, and that we're able to make sense of that student, have more insight. I mean, it changes the whole bit when we know more about what's going on. And we address things so differently too when we know the origin of certain things.
100%.
Oh, yeah. And so before I click into the documents to show you the three different documents, I wanted just to move forward a second to show, thank you, Justine, for putting this together. This is an infographic that basically just summarizes the presentation that we've done today, to kind of, for you to keep kind of like an aide-mémoire, where you've got all the considerations, you've got the reflection questions and the activity, and you also have the links to the three documents that we are suggesting to use with your school team to do the activity. And so these three documents are the CEBM Pyramid of Intervention. There's one for elementary and there's one for high school. There's the flowchart of intervention that is a second document. I'm currently working on a third document, but it won't be ready, before the new year, which will look at not just the collaboration of adults from tier to tier, but kind of answering those questions of the in-between. So how do we know, do we move, do we not move, and what do we do, and so forth. So I'll be creating this kind of arbre décisionnel, where people will be able to kind of see, have I done this, yes or no, and then kind of flowing that. And so that's to come. And of course, we cannot talk about tier 3 without talking about Bill 56 and what happens in terms of the protocols. And so these are the three documents. I'm going to click on them and hope that it's going to not mess up my sharing of the screen. I think it is. You're only seeing it.
It is a little bit, but you know what? It's okay. As long as you can even scroll down and you can just see that there's tier 1 benefits. Then it goes all the way down to tier 2 and tier 3.
I'll move here. Yeah, so you've got tier 1, and then from tier 2, and then you've got tier 3. And so that's one document. Then the other document was this one, which is the flowchart of intervention, which starts from a tier 1, who are the adults that are involved. And this is what I was talking about, the third document that I will create, which will give meat here in the in-between there. And then we move over to tier 2 and tier 3. And then, of course, the last document is the Bill 56 that is quite detailed there. And so here,
yeah, if ever anyone needs any help understanding Bill 56, every school board has an agent pivot, and they attend provincial meetings that I host. And my job is basically to support every pivot in order for them to support school teams as well as ABAV teams and their own boards. So please feel free to reach out to your agent pivot. If you don't know who they are, you can definitely reach out to maybe people at your board to see who would be representing basically your board as the agent pivot. But if there's any other questions that are a little bit deeper, they'll relay those messages to me if they're not quite sure, and I'm more than happy to help support.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Justine, for joining me on this collaboration. I think it was an important topic to cover. I often, because I present so much dense information, by the time that I'm at the end of my presentation and I'm covering tier 3, I'm kind of running through this last part, and I always feel bad that this is probably the part where adults have the most struggle with, and that we really needed to slow this down and to address it. And so thank you so much for joining me, and that we were able to do this together. I don't know if there's another piece that you want to add before we end the recording.
I think it was definitely an important piece, and it affects both of our dossiers, I think, equally in that sense. And so it's a pleasure partnering with you, Catherine. I really enjoy working and collaborating with you. So we hope it was as entertaining for everyone watching. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.